History isn't just what happened, it's also what almost happened. A single vote, one decision, one moment. What if events went another way? Join us on the journey as we explore what if Gore had won. In December 2000, the Supreme Court allowed Florida's recount to proceed. The counting lasted weeks. County officials reviewed punch card ballots one by one, determining voter intent by dimples, hanging chads, and partial perforations. When the final certification came, the margin was razor thin. Al Gore won Florida by 327 votes. With it, he secured the presidency. The legal system had spoken, but the political system had not settled. The recount's completion did not calm the country. Instead, it triggered a wave of backlash across conservative America. Within days of the final certification, Republican governors from Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama publicly criticized the recount process as inconsistent and judicially overextended. Several state legislatures passed formal resolutions expressing concern that the recount had altered the original certified outcome after weeks of litigation. In Texas, lawmakers debated a resolution affirming the state's sovereign authority under the 10th Amendment and warning against federal overreach in election law. The language was careful, but the tone was unmistakable. Talk radio amplified the message. Hosts across the South and Midwest argued that the Supreme Court's refusal to impose a uniform recount standard created unequal treatment among counties. Polls conducted in early 2001 showed that a majority of Republican voters believed the election outcome had been manipulated through legal technicalities. The legitimacy of the presidency became a partisan divide. Entrenched before the inauguration, January 20th, 2001. Security at the inauguration was visibly heavier than in recent memory. Federal agencies monitored multiple protest groups that had formed in the aftermath of the recount. While demonstrations remained largely peaceful, intelligence briefings indicated increased activity among militia networks that framed the election as federal overreach. The inauguration proceeded without incident, but the tone of the country had changed. Within weeks, state-level officials in Idaho and Alabama introduced legislation reaffirming state sovereignty and limiting cooperation with certain federal election mandates. Though symbolic, the bills reflected a growing belief that federal authority, particularly under a president viewed as procedurally tainted, required constraint. The language of states' rights, long dormant in mainstream discourse, returned to legislative chambers. September 11, 2001. The attacks stunned the nation. For a brief period, partisan divisions softened. President Gore addressed Congress within days. His language was deliberate. He did not declare a global war. He did not describe the attacks as a civilizational conflict. Instead, he framed them as a transnational criminal conspiracy enabled by intelligence failures. His administration quickly moved to restructure intelligence coordination. The CIA and FBI were integrated into a joint counter-terror directorate to streamline information sharing. Congress authorized force in Afghanistan. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time. The invasion of Afghanistan proceeded with a narrower footprint than in real history. Special Operations Forces partnered with the Northern Alliance. Coalition forces captured Kabul quickly. The Taliban government fell, but Osama bin Laden escaped into Pakistan's border regions. As months passed without his capture, criticism intensified. Republican lawmakers argued that the administration's limited approach constrained military flexibility. They contended that broader force projection, including confronting regimes believed to harbor or support terrorism, was necessary. Without the Iraq War, national security debates centered on perceived decisiveness rather than expansion. Conservative commentators linked the cautious Afghanistan strategy to broader concerns about presidential authority. The argument was subtle but persistent. A president elected through prolonged recount litigation now faced accusations of strategic hesitation. With no Iraq war draining federal resources, Gore advanced ambitious domestic priorities. In 2002 and 2003, national fuel efficiency standards tightened. Federal subsidies for wind and solar expanded significantly. Carbon trading pilot programs launched. The United States formally entered the Kyoto Protocol. Urban technology hubs flourished. Early electric vehicle incentives spurred innovation. Broadband expansion accelerated under federal investment. But in energy-producing regions, the transition was disruptive. Coal employment declined. Oil markets fluctuated under regulatory pressure. Governors from Texas, West Virginia, and Oklahoma filed coordinated legal challenges against federal emissions standards. Several states passed laws seeking to exempt local industries from certain environmental mandates, triggering constitutional disputes over federal supremacy. Protests at energy infrastructure hearings grew increasingly tense. In some rural counties, armed demonstrators appeared at public meetings to signal opposition to what they described as federal economic coercion. Law enforcement managed these incidents carefully. No large-scale violence erupted, but the symbolism was powerful. The policy debate had merged with sovereignty rhetoric. Gore's economic philosophy emphasized globalization. He expanded trade agreements, promoted cross-border environmental compacts, advanced immigration reform that broadened legal entry pathways and increased refugee admissions. The administration framed these measures as economic growth strategies. In metropolitan regions, growth accelerated. In rural areas, perception shifted. Conservative leaders framed immigration expansion as erosion of national control. Border state legislatures in Arizona and Texas passed aggressive enforcement measures that exceeded federal guidelines. Legal battles followed. Some sheriffs publicly declared they would prioritize state-level immigration enforcement over federal direction. The rhetoric intensified. National conservative conferences increasingly centered on themes of sovereignty, cultural identity, and federal restraint. The phrase constitutional resistance appeared in speeches and opinion columns, not as open rebellion, but as political mobilization. The 2004 election became a referendum not only on policy, but on legitimacy. Campaign rallies required extensive security coordination. Demonstrations outside debate venues occasionally resulted in minor clashes between opposing groups. When Gore won re-election narrowly, protests followed in several state capitals. While the vast majority were peaceful, isolated confrontations between demonstrators and law enforcement raised concerns about escalating rhetoric. Federal intelligence assessments during this period noted increased activity among militia organizations invoking constitutional language to justify expanded state autonomy. Mainstream Republican leaders condemned violence explicitly, but they continued to argue that the federal government had exceeded constitutional bounds in election law, climate regulation, and immigration policy. The combination sustained the legitimacy crisis. In this timeline, the United States avoided the Iraq War. It avoided the rise of ISIS. It advanced climate policy earlier, expanded globalization sooner, but domestically, the cost was significant. The recount resolved the numbers. It did not resolve belief. Legitimacy fractured along partisan lines. States asserted autonomy more aggressively. Federal authority faced sustained challenge. The nation did not descend into civil war, but for years, the language of constitutional confrontation edged closer to the mainstream than at any time in modern American politics, all because the Supreme Court allowed the counting to continue. And half the country decided that counting was not enough. Democracy requires more than ballots. It requires acceptance. What are history's what-ifs you'd like to see explored? Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe.